I was 19 years old the day my name was spoken for the last time in my father's house, not with love, not even with anger, but with finality, like a door being shut so hard the air itself flinched. I remember the sound more than the words. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, like it was counting down the last seconds of the girl I used to be. My mother stood behind him, hands folded tight against her apron, eyes fixed on the floor as if she could disappear into the tiles. My father didn't shout. That was the cruelest part. He didn't need to. His voice was calm, clipped, certain. He said, "If you walk out that door today, don't come back. You are no longer our daughter." 19 years old, barely a woman, barely anything at all. I remember thinking, very briefly, that this was a test. That if I begged, if I cried hard enough, if I fell to my knees like I'd seen in movies, he would soften. That my mother would finally look up and say my name. But something inside me, some quiet, stubborn spark, refused. I had already made my decision. I had been making it for months, alone in my room at night, whispering it to myself like a prayer I wasn't sure God would forgive. So I picked up my small suitcase. It was blue, with a broken zipper I had to tie with string. Everything I owned fit inside it. Dresses folded too tightly, a pair of shoes with worn soles, a photograph I slipped into my pocket at the last second, my younger self, smiling, back when love had felt unconditional. I didn't slam the door. I didn't turn around. I walked out, my legs shaking so badly I was afraid I'd fall before I reached the end of the driveway. No one followed me. No one called my name. And just like that, I vanished from my own life. People always assume they know why a family disowns a child. They fill in the blanks with the ugliest possibilities. They whisper words like shame, rebellion, disgrace. And for decades, I let them. It was easier than telling the truth. Easier than reopening wounds that never healed properly, only scarred over in strange, aching ways. For years after that day, I woke up expecting to hear my mother's footsteps in the hallway. I'd forget, just for a moment, that I was alone, that I was living in rented rooms that smelled like other people's lives, that I ate meals at small tables by myself, listening to the radio because silence felt too loud. I worked wherever I could, cafes, laundries, offices where no one remembered your name after 5 o'clock. I learned how to smile without showing too much, how to answer questions without giving anything away. When people asked about my family, I'd shrug and say, "We're not close," like it was a choice and not a sentence handed down without appeal. At night, I argued with ghosts. I replayed that moment in the kitchen again and again, changing the words, the expressions, the ending. In one version, my father reaches out and stops me. In another, my mother runs after me barefoot, crying. In none of them did I imagine the truth surfacing. Because back then, I didn't even know how deep the lie went. I married once, briefly. He was kind in the way men can be kind when they don't ask too many questions. When he found out I had no family to invite to the wedding, he looked at me differently. Not cruelly, pityingly. That was worse. The marriage didn't last. I don't blame him. I was carrying too many locked doors inside me. Years passed. Decades, really. The world changed in ways I couldn't keep up with. People walked faster, spoke louder, forgot how to sit still. I aged quietly. Lines appeared on my hands, then my face. I became invisible in the way older women do, and there was a strange comfort in that. No one looked too closely. No one asked why my eyes sometimes filled with tears at the most ordinary things. A child laughing, a mother brushing her daughter's hair. I told myself I had survived. That survival was enough. But the past has a way of waiting patiently. It doesn't rush. It knows you'll slow down eventually. When I was 78, my hands stiff with arthritis and my steps measured and careful, a letter arrived that changed everything. Just an envelope, cream-colored, my name written in a handwriting I didn't recognize, but somehow did. The paper trembled between my fingers as I opened it. I felt 19 again. Small, exposed, terrified. Inside was a single sentence that cracked my life open like old wood. We need to talk about what really happened. I sat there for a long time, the letter resting in my lap, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might finally give up on me. The truth. After all these years, after all this silence, I had no idea then that the decision I made at 19 wasn't the betrayal my family claimed it was, that the real betrayal had already happened, behind my back, wrapped in love's disguise, and that by the time the truth finally surfaced, almost everyone who could answer for it would be gone. If you think being disowned at 19 breaks you, try discovering at 78 that your entire life was built on someone else's lie. But that is a story that takes time to tell. The letter sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I touched it again. 3 days of walking past it like it might bite me, like it carried a disease I wasn't sure my heart could survive. I brewed tea I never drank. I stood at the window and watched strangers live their lives below, laughing, arguing, existing so easily. All the while that sentence echoed in my head, what really happened, as if my entire life had been one long misunderstanding, a story told wrong from the very beginning. On the fourth day, I read it again. Slower this time. The handwriting wavered in places, thin and uneven, the way hands get when age has already started loosening its grip. At the bottom was a name I hadn't spoken out loud in nearly 60 years. My cousin Margaret. Margaret had been my shadow when we were girls. A year older, sharper-tongued, always watching. She had stayed behind when I left. Stayed loyal. Stayed loved. Or so I'd believed. I told myself not to respond. I was old, tired. What good could come of stirring bones that had been buried for decades? I had lived my life. I had made peace with the idea that some questions don't get answers. But peace, I learned too late, is not the same as truth. My hands shook as I wrote back. Just a few words, careful ones, words that didn't accuse or beg. I asked where. I asked when. I asked why now. Her reply came quickly, too quickly, like she'd been waiting with the envelope already stamped. She wrote that she was ill. That time was short. That there were things she could no longer carry alone. She gave an address, my childhood town, the one I'd sworn never to return to, and a date. I didn't sleep the night before I left. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting every mistake I thought I'd made since 19, every step that had led me farther and farther away from the girl I used to be. I wondered if my parents were still alive, even though some part of me already knew the answer. I wondered if they had ever said my name again after I left, or if it had been erased like chalk from a board. The train ride felt endless. The landscape outside the window blurred into a long ribbon of memory, fields, fences, rooftops that all looked vaguely familiar, like dreams you can't quite place. My body ached in ways it never had before. Age makes everything heavier, even regret. When I stepped onto the platform, my knees nearly buckled. The air smelled the same, damp earth and iron and something sweet I couldn't name. The town hadn't changed much. Or maybe it had changed completely, and I was the one frozen in time. Margaret lived in a small house near the edge of town. I recognized the street instantly. I'd walked it 100 times as a girl, whispering secrets I thought would never leave us. When she opened the door, I barely recognized her. Her hair was white, her face folded in on itself like paper that's been handled too often. But her eyes, sharp, restless, were exactly the same. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking. I expected tears, anger, accusations. Instead, she said my name softly, like she was tasting it. "You came," she said. "I almost didn't," I replied. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. She stepped aside to let me in. Her house smelled of medicine and old books. We sat at a small table in the kitchen, hands wrapped around mugs neither of us drank from. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. "I don't know where to start," she said finally. "Start with the truth," I said. My voice surprised me. It was steady, harder than I felt. Margaret's hands trembled as she folded them together. "You were disowned because of me," she said. The words landed like a blow to the chest. I felt the air leave my lungs. She went on before I could speak, her voice cracking. She told me about the night everything changed. The night my father had found something he wasn't meant to see. The night she had lied. I listened, frozen, as decades rearranged themselves in my mind. She told me that my decision at 19, the one my family claimed had shamed them, was never the real reason. It had been a convenient excuse, a cover, a story easier to swallow than the truth. What really happened, she said, was that my father had discovered her secret, one that would have destroyed the family's carefully built image if it came out. And she, terrified and selfish, had let him believe it was mine. "I thought it would blow over," she whispered. "I thought he'd cool down. I never imagined he'd cast you out completely." I felt something tear inside me then. Not loudly, quietly, like fabric ripping where it's already worn thin. My entire life, my loneliness, my exile, my unanswered questions, had been built on a lie that wasn't even mine. "Why didn't you tell them?" I asked. "Why didn't you tell the truth?" She looked away. "Because once you were gone, the danger was gone too." I stood up so suddenly my chair scraped loudly against the floor. My heart pounded in my ears. Anger surged through me, hot, blinding, terrifying. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand back the years she'd stolen. But when I looked at her, small, frail, already halfway gone, I felt something else too. Grief. For both of us. For the girl she had been. For the girl I had lost. "You let me live as a ghost," I said quietly. Tears streamed down her face. "I know, and I'm so sorry." Sorry. Such a small word for a lifetime of silence. I left her house before dusk. I couldn't stay. I couldn't forgive. Not yet. Outside, the sky was turning the same bruised purple I remembered from childhood evenings. I walked the streets until my legs burned, past my old school, my old home. Someone else lived there now. Laughter spilled from windows that once held my family's voices. That night, in a small hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and finally cried the way I never had at 19. Loud, ugly, uncontrolled. I cried for the parents who never knew the truth, for the life I might have had, for the decades I spent believing I was unlovable. But somewhere beneath the pain, something else stirred. A question I hadn't dared ask before. If the truth had been buried all this time, what else had been hidden from me? And what would it cost at 78 to finally reclaim my name? That was when the real mystery began. I didn't go back to Margaret's house the next day, or the day after that. I wandered instead, like a woman haunting the outline of her own past. The town felt smaller now, tighter somehow, as if it had been holding its breath all these years and was only just exhaling. Every corner whispered memories I hadn't invited back, chalk dust on my fingers, the scrape of my shoes on pavement, my father's voice calling me in before dark. I stood across the street from my old home for a long time. The front door was painted a cheerful yellow now. A swing hung from the tree in the yard, creaking gently in the breeze. Someone had planted roses where my mother once grew herbs. I tried to imagine her hands there pressing soil around new roots, humming under her breath. The thought nearly brought me to my knees. I realized then that Margaret's confession, as devastating as it was, still wasn't complete. There were gaps too wide to ignore. Too many decisions made by too many people for one frightened girl's lie to carry that kind of power. My father had always been rigid, yes, proud, unforgiving. But disowning me completely? Cutting me off as if I had never existed? That level of finality didn't come from disappointment alone. It came from fear. I needed answers from the only place left that might still hold them. The church. I hadn't stepped inside it since the week before I left town at 19. The doors were heavier than I remembered, the wood darkened by time and hands and grief. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of candle wax and dust. I slid into a pew near the back, my bones aching as I sat. The silence pressed down on me, thick with unspoken prayers. A man approached after the service ended, younger than me but old enough to have that solemn, careful look of someone who listens to secrets for a living. He introduced himself, asked if I needed anything. I told him my name. His face changed, not dramatically, just enough. A flicker of recognition he tried, and failed, to hide. "I think," he said slowly, "you should come with me." He led me into a small office tucked behind the sanctuary, shelves lined with old books, records, ledgers, the kind of place where lives are summarized in neat handwriting. He hesitated before pulling out a file, thick and yellowed with age. "These aren't meant to be revisited lightly," he said. "I've lived lightly long enough," I replied. He opened the folder. Inside were documents I had never known existed, notes, correspondence, a formal statement signed by my father, a statement I had never seen, never been told about. It detailed a grave moral failing that, according to him, left him no choice but to sever ties completely. But the name written there, on the original report, wasn't mine. It was crossed out. And beneath it, in darker ink, my name had been written instead. I felt cold spread through my chest, like ice water poured straight into my heart. My hands gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. "He changed it," I whispered. The man nodded grimly. "From what I understand, it was done to protect the family." Protect. That word again. Always protection, never justice. The file contained something else. A birth record, not mine, another child, born quietly, quickly removed from the town, sent away. Margaret's child. The room tilted. The pieces finally slammed together with a force that stole my breath. The secret my father had discovered. The lie that saved Margaret. The reason my existence suddenly became expendable. I wasn't disowned because of what I did. I was sacrificed. I walked out of the church in a daze, the bell tolling behind me like a verdict. Every step felt unreal. My entire identity, every shame I'd carried, every apology I'd rehearsed in my head for decades, crumbled into dust. I wasn't the family disgrace. I was the cover-up. That night, I dreamed of a baby crying somewhere far away. I woke with tears soaking my pillow and a name on my lips I didn't recognize. I went back to Margaret's house the next morning. She knew why I was there before I spoke. Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her like air from a punctured lung. She admitted everything then. The child, the panic, the way my father had offered a solution so clean and cruel she had grabbed it without question. "You were strong," she said, voice breaking. "You could survive being sent away." I wasn't. I stared at her, seeing her not as my betrayer, but as a frightened girl trapped by the same rigid rules that destroyed us both. "Where is the child?" I asked. Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. They took him. I was never allowed to ask." Something shifted inside me then. Not forgiveness, not yet, but purpose. A fire I thought age had burned out long ago. For the first time since I was 19, I wasn't running from the past. I was walking straight into it. If the truth had stolen my life, then the truth, finally faced, would give me something back. Even if it was only answers. even if it was only peace, even if it came far too late. I thought age had taken my appetite for upheaval. I was wrong. It had only taught me patience. And patience, I discovered, can be far more dangerous than rage. I stayed in town longer than I planned. Days blurred together as I followed threads I never knew existed, tugging gently at first, then harder when they didn't break. Records offices, quiet conversations with people who squinted at me, trying to place my face. Old neighbors who remembered my parents, but not me. At least not until I said my name slowly, carefully, like a spell. Some of them flinched. That hurt more than I expected. I learned that after I left, my name had become something like a curse, spoken rarely, carefully. My father had told people I was unstable, ungrateful, that I'd chosen a life that made reconciliation impossible. People nodded. People always do when a confident man explains away cruelty with certainty. Margaret stayed inside most days. When I did see her, she looked smaller than ever, as if the truth leaking out of her had taken pieces of her with it. We spoke little. There was nothing left to argue about. The facts stood between us now, heavy and unmovable. The child, her child, haunted me. A life set adrift because it was inconvenient. A boy, according to the records, born in secrecy, erased almost immediately. I couldn't stop thinking about him growing up somewhere else, with a different name, different parents, no idea that his existence had detonated an entire family. In quiet moments, a shameful thought crept in. He should have been mine. Not in the way you might think, not biologically, but in the way responsibility shifts when someone else pays the price for your survival. I had lived 78 years carrying guilt that was never mine, while he, wherever he was, had lived a life shaped by lies he never consented to. I owed him something, even if he never knew it. The search was slow, painfully so. Records from that era were vague, deliberately obscured. Adoption files sealed tighter than vaults. Each dead end felt like another door slammed in my face, familiar, infuriating. But this time, I didn't turn away. Then one afternoon, in an office that smelled of paper and old coffee, a woman slid a thin folder across a desk toward me. Her voice was gentle, apologetic. "This is all we can release," she said. Inside was a name, not the one Margaret had given him. A new one, a placement location, a date. I stared at it until the letters blurred. This scrap of information, was the closest I'd ever come to touching the truth. I didn't know what I expected when I followed it. Some dramatic reunion, a face that mirrored Margaret's eyes or my father's stubborn jaw. But when I finally tracked him down, weeks later, all I found was a headstone. He had died young, 42, heart condition. I stood there in the small cemetery, wind tugging at my coat, and felt something inside me collapse. A grief I had no language for, mourning someone I had never met, but had unknowingly carried with me my entire life. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the stone. "I should have been braver." The unfairness of it all pressed down on me then, not sharply, but steadily, like weight added one stone at a time until breathing becomes work. My parents were gone. The truth too late for apologies. Margaret was fading fast. The boy was already dust. So what was left? I returned to my hotel room that evening and sat on the bed, hands folded in my lap, staring at nothing. For the first time since the letter arrived, I felt truly old. Not fragile, just aware of time slipping through my fingers faster than I could gather it. That's when I realized something quietly astonishing. The truth had finally surfaced, but it hadn't been meant to save me. It was meant to free me. All my life, I had believed I was unworthy of love, that something fundamentally wrong inside me had driven my family away. That belief had shaped every relationship, every risk I didn't take, every apology I made for existing. And now that belief was gone. I wasn't broken. I had been chosen, wrongly, cruelly, to be the one who disappeared so others could remain intact. The power of that realization frightened me. I went back to my childhood home one last time before leaving town. I didn't knock. I didn't want explanations or permission. I stood on the sidewalk and spoke my truth into the open air, letting it settle wherever it wished. I was innocent, I said aloud. My voice didn't shake. I always was. The next morning I packed my things. Before boarding the train, I visited Margaret. She was sleeping, shallow breaths lifting her chest. I sat beside her bed and held her hand. Not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. Two women shaped by fear. Two lives bent by silence. I won't carry this anymore, I told her softly. It ends with me. She stirred, eyes fluttering open for a moment. Tears slid down into the creases of her face. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. As the train pulled away from the town that had defined and destroyed me, I felt something unfamiliar bloom in my chest. Lightness. Not happiness. Not joy. Freedom. And for the first time since I was 19, I wasn't running from my past. I was leaving it behind. Truth told, name restored, life finally my own. One part remained. The ending I never thought I'd get. I returned home a different woman, though nothing about my apartment had changed. The same narrow hallway, the same chair by the window, the same crack in the wall I'd meant to fix for years and never did. But the silence felt different now. It no longer accused me. It listened. For days I moved slowly, deliberately, as if learning how to live inside my own skin again. I cooked meals I didn't rush through. I slept without waking in a panic. My heart no longer braced for punishment. And yet, beneath the calm, something restless stirred. A question that refused to be quiet. What does a woman do with the truth when it arrives at 78? I had been defined for so long by absence, by what was taken, what was denied, what was never explained, that I wasn't sure how to exist without that weight. It was like carrying a heavy bag for decades, only to have it lifted suddenly. Relief came first, then imbalance. I found myself thinking about my parents more than I had in years, not with longing, but with clarity. I could see my father now, not as the towering judge of my youth, but as a man trapped by his own terror of shame. A man who chose control over compassion and called it righteousness. My mother, too. Her silence no longer just weakness, but fear stitched into every breath she took. They had failed me, completely. And still, they were human. That realization didn't soften the pain, but it untangled it. I no longer needed to hate them to justify my hurt. The truth stood on its own. One afternoon, while sorting through old papers, I came across the photograph I'd taken with me the day I left home. The edges were curled now, the image faded. A girl stared back at me with bright eyes and no idea how much she was about to lose. I held it between my fingers for a long time. "I'm sorry," I whispered to her. "You didn't deserve what they did to you." The words unlocked something I hadn't known was sealed shut. For the first time, I allowed myself to grieve not just the family I lost, but the woman I never got to become. The paths I didn't take because I believed I wasn't allowed to want too much. The love I pushed away before it could abandon me. Grief came in waves, some gentle, some violent. I let them come. Weeks passed. Margaret died quietly, according to a short notice I received in the mail. No letter this time, no last confession, just an ending. I sat with the news longer than I expected. I didn't attend the funeral. That chapter was closed, and reopening it would have served neither of us. But the boy, the man, she had lost, never left my thoughts. Even in death, he mattered, especially in death. I began writing to him, though there was no address to send the letters to. I told him about the truth, about the lie that shaped us both. about how sorry I was that the world had decided he was a problem to be solved instead of a life to be cherished. Writing became a kind of salvation. I wrote about everything: the day I was disowned, the years of silence, the letter that cracked everything open. I wrote with shaking hands and a steady heart, pouring out a story I had spent a lifetime compressing into polite half sentences. At first, I told myself it was just for me, a way to set the record straight before I was gone. But then a thought crept in, bold and terrifying. What if my story wasn't meant to die with me? There are so many young women, so many people, walking around carrying shame that doesn't belong to them, believing lies because they were spoken by voices that sounded like authority. What if telling the truth, even now, could loosen that grip for someone else? The idea scared me. I had lived quietly for so long. Stepping forward felt indulgent, dangerous. But I had already lost so much time to fear. I refused to lose what little remained. So I shared my story, not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly. I sent it to a small community newsletter. I posted it on a modest online forum where people shared memories and regrets and hard-won wisdom. I didn't expect much. I was wrong. Messages began to arrive, from strangers, from people younger than my grandchildren would have been, had my life unfolded differently. They wrote to say they saw themselves in my words, that they too had been cast out, misunderstood, sacrificed, that reading my story made them feel less alone. One message, in particular, stopped me cold. It was from a man in his early 40s. He wrote that he had been adopted from the same region around the same time, that he had always felt a strange hollowness, a sense of being untethered. He didn't know why, but something about my story had pulled at him. My heart pounded as I read his words. The timing was wrong, the details didn't align perfectly. I used to believe endings were something that happened to you, that they arrived uninvited, wrapped in circumstances you didn't choose, like the day I was disowned, like the letter that shattered 70 years of carefully contained pain. But as my body slowed and my days grew quieter, I learned something no one tells you when you're young. At the end of a life, you are finally allowed to choose how the story closes. Not how it began, not how it was twisted by other people's fear, but how it settles. The messages kept coming for months, some short, some long and trembling. People confessed things to me they had never said out loud before: estrangements, betrayals, decisions made too young under too much pressure. They thanked me for surviving, for telling the truth even when it arrived late. Each message stitched something back together inside me. I had spent decades thinking my life was small because it had been quiet. Now I saw it differently. Quiet lives still echo, sometimes louder than we ever expect. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls gold, I took out a fresh notebook and wrote my name at the top of the page. Just my name. No apology attached to it, no explanation, no shame. I wrote the whole story again, this time not as a confession, but as a declaration. I wrote about the girl who walked out with a blue suitcase and a shaking spine. I wrote about the woman who survived loneliness without letting it turn her cruel. I wrote about the old woman who learned finally that she had never been the problem. When I finished, I closed the notebook and rested my hands on it, feeling a deep, unfamiliar peace settle into my bones. I didn't need my parents' forgiveness. They had lived and died inside a lie they chose to protect. I didn't need Margaret's either. Her remorse, however real, could never give me back what was taken. What I needed, what I had needed all along, was my own absolution. I began doing small, brave things I'd always postponed. I wore brighter colors. I spoke up when I disagreed instead of shrinking into politeness. I laughed louder. I let people see me, really see me, wrinkles in history and all. One afternoon, a young woman stopped me on the street. She recognized me from my writing. Her eyes filled with tears, as she told me she was 19 and facing a choice her family didn't support. She was terrified of being cut off, of losing everything. I took her hands in mine, warm, steady, alive. "Listen to me," I said. "If they turn away, it will hurt, deeply, but it will not define your worth. Don't carry a lie just to stay loved." She nodded, crying openly now, and hugged me like I was something solid in a world that suddenly felt too sharp. As I walked home that day, it struck me how strange and beautiful life can be. How the very wound that nearly destroyed me had become the place others found shelter. Time did what time always does. My steps grew slower, my hands weaker, but my mind, my heart, had never been clearer. One night, as I lay in bed listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing, I thought again of the girl I had been at 19. I imagined sitting beside her on that narrow bed, her suitcase at her feet, fear trembling through her bones. "You're going to lose a lot," I would tell her gently, "but you're going to keep the most important thing." "What's that?" she would ask. "Your truth." When my doctor spoke carefully about time and limits and preparation, I wasn't afraid. I had already done the hardest work. I had named what happened. I had reclaimed what was mine. I had forgiven myself for surviving the only way I knew how. I wrote one final letter, not to the past, but to the future. To anyone who might find my words after I was gone. I told them this: you can be disowned and still belong to yourself. You can be blamed and still be innocent. You can lose decades to a lie and still end your life in truth. The truth didn't surface until I was 78. But it didn't arrive too late. It arrived exactly when I was finally ready to live without fear. And when my time comes, when I close my eyes for the last time, I will not be thinking of the door that slammed shut when I was 19. I will be thinking of the one I opened myself. At last. The nights grew softer after that, like the world was finally speaking to me in a voice I could understand. I slept with the window cracked open, even in the cold, because I liked the reminder that air moves, that nothing stays trapped forever. Sometimes I woke before dawn and lay still, listening to the distant sounds of life beginning again. Cars, footsteps, a bird brave enough to sing first. Each morning felt borrowed in the best possible way. I began putting my affairs in order, not with sadness, but with care. I labeled photographs. I folded clothes I would never wear again. I sorted papers slowly, thoughtfully, as if each decision mattered, because it did. I wanted no confusion left behind, no unanswered questions. I had lived too long inside those. I left instructions that my story be kept intact, not polished, not softened. Truth does not need makeup. I asked that my writing be shared freely, without my name if necessary, because what mattered wasn't recognition, it was release. I wanted my words to find people the way the truth had finally found me. Some evenings, I lit a candle and spoke aloud to those who were gone, not in accusation, not in longing, just acknowledgement. My parents, Margaret, the boy who never got to know how much his existence mattered. I told them I was finished carrying what belonged to them. I told them I hoped they had found peace wherever they were. And then I blew out the candle and let the smoke drift upward, unburdened. There was a strange joy in this season of my life, a gentleness. I noticed small things again, the way tea tastes better when you don't rush it, how sunlight settles differently on old skin, how laughter comes easier when you're no longer afraid of being misunderstood. I had nothing left to prove, nothing left to hide. One afternoon, I sat by the window with my notebook open, not to write, but to rest my hand on the page. I realized then that I no longer felt unfinished. That surprised me. I had always thought closure was a dramatic thing, some grand moment of understanding. Instead, it arrived quietly, like acceptance slipping into place when you're not looking. I had not gotten justice in the way stories often promise. No apologies from the dead, no dramatic reckonings. But I had gotten something far rarer: clarity. I understood now that my life had never been wasted, only misunderstood. That the years I spent alone were not proof of failure, but evidence of resilience. That surviving without answers had shaped me into someone capable of holding truth without collapsing beneath it. On my last birthday, I didn't wish for more time. I wished for continued honesty, for myself, and for anyone who carried my story forward. I blew out the candles slowly, deliberately, and smiled at the quiet room. If you are reading this and you are young, frightened, standing at the edge of a decision that may cost you everything, listen to me. Families can be wrong. Authority can lie. Silence can masquerade as love. Do not let fear convince you that being cast out means you are unworthy. Sometimes it means you were chosen to survive what others could not face. If you are older, weighed down by decades of doubt, wondering if it's too late for the truth, listen even closer. It is never too late to reclaim yourself. The truth does not age, it waits. I was disowned at 19 for a decision I made believing it was mine alone to carry. The truth didn't surface until I was 78. And when it didn't give me back my youth, my family, or the years I lost. It gave me something better. My name, untarnished. My life, reframed. My ending, chosen. I leave this world knowing who I was. And that, after everything, is enough. There is a moment near the very end when the body grows quiet in a way the mind does not. I felt it coming, not like fear, not like pain, but like a long walk finally easing into a chair. My breath slowed. Time softened around the edges. And in that stillness, memories didn't rush at me the way people say they do. They arrived gently, one by one, as if asking permission. I thought of that 19-year-old girl again, not standing in the kitchen this time, not clutching the blue suitcase. I saw her years later, working late, eating alone, learning how to survive on her own terms. I saw her choosing kindness even when bitterness would have been easier. I saw her choosing honesty with herself even when the world had never been honest with her, and for the first time, I felt proud. Not in a loud way, not in a way that demanded witnesses. Just a quiet certainty that settled deep in my chest. You did well with what you were given. I used to believe my life had been defined by what was taken from me. A family, a home, a sense of belonging. But as I lay there, wrapped in thin blankets and softer thoughts, I realized something truer. My life was defined by what I refused to surrender. I refused to become cruel. I refused to lie to make others comfortable. I refused to disappear, even when everyone expected me to. That is not a small legacy. There was no one at my bedside when the final hours drew near, and that was all right. Loneliness had once terrified me, but it no longer held that power. I had learned the difference between being alone and being erased. I was not erased, not anymore. The room was quiet except for the steady hum of the world continuing on without me. I imagined my words traveling where I could not, slipping into the hands of strangers, settling into hearts that needed them. I imagined a young woman reading my story late at night, realizing she wasn't broken. I imagined an older soul finally setting down a burden they'd carried too long. If that happened even once, then everything, every loss, every silent year, had meaning. In those last moments, I did not think of my parents with anger. I thought of them as they were before fear hardened them. I released them fully then, not for their sake but for mine. I thought of Margaret too, not as the woman who betrayed me, but as the girl who was too afraid to be honest in a world that punished women for their mistakes. Understanding did not excuse her actions, but it freed me from needing to keep reliving them. And the boy, the man, whose life intersected with mine only through consequence and silence. I thought of him with tenderness. I hoped he had known love somewhere. I hoped he had laughed easily. I hoped the world had been kinder to him than it had been to us. As my breath grew shallower, one final truth settled over me like a blessing. The lie had taken my family, but the truth had given me myself. That is a fair trade, even if it came late. If you measure a life only by comfort, mine might look small. If you measure it by courage, by endurance, by the willingness to face the truth when it finally arrives, then mine was vast. I did not die as the girl who was disowned. I died as the woman who understood. And if there is anything waiting beyond this moment, anything at all, I will step into it without shame, without fear, carrying nothing that does not belong to me. My story does not end in bitterness. It does not end in regret. It ends in clarity. It ends in peace. It ends with my name, spoken at last without distortion, without apology, without the weight of someone else's sin pressed into it. I was innocent. I always was. And now, finally, the world knows it too. After the breath left me, after the room grew still and the night completed its quiet work, my story did not vanish the way I once had. That was the last surprise life offered me. I didn't know it then, of course. I couldn't. But stories, when told honestly, have a strange way of refusing to die. They linger. They move. They find hands and hearts long after the voice that first carried them has gone silent. Weeks later, someone found my notebook. A neighbor. Kind, curious. The sort of woman who notices when curtains stay closed too long. She followed the instructions I'd left behind, the careful notes written in steady ink. She didn't change a word. She didn't soften the edges. She let the truth stand exactly as it was. And so my life, once reduced to whispers and omissions, began again in another form. People read it slowly. Some had to stop and come back later. Some cried in places they didn't expect. Some felt anger rise on my behalf, a protective instinct that came decades too late but still mattered. Many recognized themselves between the lines, in the girl who was blamed, in the woman who survived quietly, in the old soul who learned too late that she had never been wrong to exist. That is the strange mercy of time. It takes much, but it also returns things in unexpected ways. I like to think of it this way. At 19, my family erased me to protect a lie. At 78, the truth returned me to the world, not to them, to you, to anyone who has ever been cast out for carrying the consequences of someone else's fear, to anyone who has lived half a lifetime believing a story that was never theirs to own, to anyone who thinks the truth arriving late means it has lost its power. It hasn't. Truth does not expire. It does not weaken with age. It waits. And when it finally surfaces, it does something remarkable. It rearranges the past, not by changing what happened, but by changing what it meant. My exile was never proof of my failure. It was evidence of my strength being misused by others. My silence was never consent. It was survival. My loneliness was not a punishment. It was the cost of refusing to live inside a lie. If I could leave you with one final thing, one last hand on yours across time, it would be this. Do not rush your healing to satisfy people who benefited from your pain. Do not apologize for needing answers. Do not mistake endurance for weakness. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is live on without explanation, until the day explanation finally arrives. I didn't get the life I imagined at 19. I didn't get parents who chose me over appearances. I didn't get justice in the courtroom sense of the word. But I did get something rarer. I got to know, before the end, that I was never the villain in my own story. And knowing that, truly knowing it, changed everything. If you're standing where I once stood, trembling with a decision that may cost you love, comfort, or belonging, remember this old woman who walked out with a broken suitcase and lived long enough to see the truth come home without her. Sometimes the truth doesn't save your relationships. Sometimes it doesn't save your youth. But it will save you. And in the end, that is enough. That has always been enough.